In a quiet cafe corner, two people sit side by side. No phones, no music, no words, just shared silence. They don't need to speak. There's a warmth, a gravity, something palpable hanging between them. And yet, to an outside observer, it may seem like nothing is happening at all. But look beneath the surface, inside their brains, inside their bodies, and a different story unfolds. A silent symphony is playing. Brainwaves are aligning. Heartbeats, once separate, begin to echo one another. Cortisol, the stress hormone, dips. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, rises. Something real is happening biologically, neurologically, emotionally, in the absence of words. So what exactly happens in the brain and body when two people share silence? Is silence truly just the absence of sound, or is it a kind of language all its own, one that bypasses words to speak directly to the nervous system? Emerging science suggests that silence is far from empty. In fact, moments of quiet shared between individuals can foster profound physiological alignment. In studies observing long-term meditation partners or Zen monks in shared stillness, researchers have recorded striking neural synchrony using IG technology. Their brainwaves, once distinct, begin to mirror each other, as if orchestrated by some unseen conductor. In romantic couples, something equally extraordinary occurs. Heart rates begin to match. Breathing patterns synchronize, and even hormone levels, like cortisol and oxytocin, adjust in tandem. Without a single word, their bodies begin to speak the same silent language. This phenomenon is part of a broader process scientists call co-regulation, the way in which our nervous systems unconsciously calibrate to one another. It's the reason a baby calms when held by a relaxed parent. It's why we feel a sense of peace sitting with a trusted friend, even in silence. Our bodies are constantly listening, not just with ears, but with cells, hormones, and electric signals. And silence, it turns out, may be one of the most profound stimuli in that hidden dialogue. Yet we live in a world addicted to noise, to expressiveness, to connection through conversation, emoji, and constant communication. In such a culture, silence is often interpreted as awkwardness, disconnection, or emotional vacancy. But what if that's not just wrong? What if it's biologically backwards? What if silence is not the absence of connection, but a deeper, more primal form of it? What if, in a world increasingly filled with words, silence is the only thing left that can still speak directly to the soul and to the body? This is the paradox at the heart of human connection. While we chase meaning through language, we may be overlooking one of the most powerful forms of communication available to us, the shared quiet, where nothing is said and yet everything is felt. Silence, though often overlooked in modern life, has long been a vital thread woven through the fabric of human history, not as a void, but as a presence, a tool, even a sacred act. Across cultures and centuries, silence has served not just spiritual aims, but deeply social and biological ones. In Native American traditions, periods of silence were essential in council circles, where listening was considered a moral and communal act. Speaking too quickly, without thoughtful pause, was seen as careless or even disrespectful. In Buddhist monastic life, silence is a cornerstone practice, a gateway to insight, empathy, and unity. In early Christian monasticism, the great silence marked the hours after evening prayers, a time to reconnect inwardly and with God, but also to foster communal peace. These weren't just spiritual performances, they were practices grounded in deep attunement to the rhythms of the body and the emotional states of others. Silence also played a crucial role in indigenous systems of conflict resolution, where heated debate was cooled not through argument but through long, reflective silences. These moments allowed emotions to settle, permitted deeper truths to rise, and created space for empathy to flourish. In these settings, silence was not absence, it was active, even alive. Today, neuroscience is beginning to catch up with what these ancient cultures intuited, that silence is biologically powerful. When two people share a moment of nonverbal presence, even without touch or speech, something remarkable happens. Mirror neurons in the brain begin to fire as if experiencing the other's internal state. The vagus nerve, which governs our parasympathetic rest and digest system, becomes activated, lowering heart rate and promoting calm. Oxytocin, the hormone responsible for bonding and trust, increases. The body responds not to sound, but to presence, to the simple awareness of another person in stillness. Yet this deep biological tuning is under siege in the modern world. We are living in an era of unprecedented noise, literal and metaphorical. Urban environments flood us with sonic clutter, traffic, construction, digital pings, ambient chatter. These aren't just annoyances. Chronic exposure to noise has been linked to a host of stress-related disorders, including hypertension, sleep disruption, impaired immunity, and even anxiety and depression. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and rewire, becomes impaired under constant auditory assault. Cortisol rhythms, which regulate our energy and stress cycles, are thrown out of balance. The body, never allowed to rest, slips into chronic fight or flight, a silent epidemic with no sirens. In response, a quiet revolution is underway. Tech companies now build silent rooms, minimalist spaces designed for deep focus and burnout recovery. Hospitals are incorporating sensory reduction spaces for patients and clinicians alike. Recognizing the healing power of stillness, and in the field of psychotherapy, the language of healing is shifting. Somatic therapy, trauma-informed care, and polyvagal approaches are emphasizing something radical, that the most important part of healing might not be what is said, but what is felt in the presence of a calm, regulated other. Silent presence, in these contexts, becomes more therapeutic than talk. The body, long overwhelmed by sound and overstimulation, finally finds a place to rest and rewire. This brings us to a strange and urgent paradox. We are more connected than ever, constantly messaging, speaking, broadcasting. And yet, we are biologically starving. Not for isolation, but for silence. Not for solitude, but for shared quietude. Moments where no one needs to perform, where nothing needs to be said, and where nervous systems can simply exist together, unguarded. In an age of relentless digital noise and performative expression, what we long for is not more words, it's the refuge of mutual stillness. What ancient rituals, offered through sacred silence, we now must rediscover through science, through therapy, and perhaps most importantly, through each other. Certainly, here is your inciting discovery dilemma section, rewritten entirely in paragraph form for narrative flow, with all key points preserved. In 2006, a group of neuroscientists set out to explore how different types of sound, from classical music to ambient noise, affect the brain's stress levels and cognitive activity. But what they didn't expect was that silence, used as a control condition, would outperform every sonic stimulus. 2 minutes of silence produced deeper relaxation, reduced cortisol levels, and increased brain activity in regions associated with memory and emotional regulation. It was a startling discovery. Silence wasn't neutral, it was medicinal. A few years later, in 2013, another study explored the impact of auditory environments on brain plasticity. Again, the most remarkable outcome came from silence. Mice exposed to just 2 minutes of quiet experienced increased neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the brain's memory and emotional integration center. In the absence of input, the brain began to grow. More recently, studies of silent meditation retreats have added even more depth to the picture. Neuroscientists using MRI scans discovered that participants showed increased gray matter density in regions tied to empathy, memory, and self-awareness. Silence wasn't passive, it was regenerative. It seemed to reorganize the brain's architecture in ways that language, stimulation, or even music could not. But this raised a difficult question. If silence is so profoundly healing, why is it treated as a problem? Why have we, as a culture, designed a world that actively prevents it? The answer lies partly in perception. In many Western cultures, silence is often interpreted as a void, an awkward pause, an emotional absence, a failure to engage. From early childhood, we're taught to fill space with words. In classrooms, students who are quiet are often assumed to be disengaged or uncertain. In social settings, silence is frequently met with discomfort or suspicion. It is viewed not as presence, but as absence, something to be fixed. But this interpretation is not universal. In many indigenous cultures, silence is a sign of respect, an opportunity for deep listening rather than performance. In Japanese communication, silent pauses are seen as thoughtful and intentional. The problem is not silence itself, but the way we've been conditioned to fear it. One of the richest counterexamples comes from the deaf community, where silence is not seen as a limitation, but as a foundation for complex and nuanced communication. In American Sign Language, meaning is conveyed not just through hand movements, but through facial expressions, body posture, and subtle shifts in gaze. Emotional nuance, empathy, humor, tension is expressed without sound. Neuroscientific research has shown that deaf signers activate many of the same brain regions involved in spoken language, and in some areas, even more robustly. Studies have found stronger interhemispheric connections and increased activity in areas responsible for social bonding and emotional processing. This reveals a deeper truth. Silence is not the absence of communication. It's a different language, a language of presence, rhythm, and embodied meaning. But this brings us to an ethical dilemma, one that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of biology, economics, and culture. In a world driven by monetized attention, silence holds no market value. It can't be packaged, branded, or endlessly refreshed. Our devices are designed to prevent it. Notifications interrupt it. Background noise masks it. Even mindfulness apps, which claim to promote stillness, often clutter themselves with achievements, soundscapes, and reminders, turning the promise of silence into yet another form of stimulation. And so we are left with a quiet contradiction. Our brains need something that society is actively engineering out of existence. The more we learn about silence, its power to heal trauma, regulate emotion, and foster human connection, the more urgent the question becomes: can we protect something that cannot be sold? In many ways, silence is becoming an endangered state. Not in the metaphorical sense, but in the biological one. As urban noise, digital overload, and performative communication consume more of our daily lives, the spaces for shared stillness are shrinking. But what we lose in silence isn't just peace, it's the neurological foundation for empathy, memory, and self-awareness. If silence is the condition in which the mind begins to integrate, the body begins to heal, and people begin to attune, then the cost of its disappearance is not just psychological, it's civilizational. Asterisk, asterisk, the loudest thing we never hear. Asterisk, asterisk, why does silence feel so uncomfortable, and yet so necessary? It's a paradox that nags at the edge of our modern minds, buzzing louder the quieter it gets. We turn off the music, close the door, and suddenly the air seems heavier, as if absence has weight. For some, it's peaceful. For others, it's unbearable. But why? What exactly happens when the world around us stops speaking? In a silent retreat nestled deep in the woods, a group of strangers sits in stillness. No talking, no phones, no eye contact, just breath, space, and the deafening presence of nothing. Within days, participants begin to unravel. Some weep uncontrollably, others tremble with anxiety, not because they're overwhelmed by sensation, but because sensation has vanished. It's not stimulation, but the stark lack of it, that forces a confrontation with something deeper, the self, stripped bare. In the absence of noise, what rises is everything we've been drowning out. And yet, this experience of silence isn't foreign to our biology. For millions of years, humans evolved in acoustic environments defined by softness, rustling leaves, wind across open plains, the hush of night. Our nervous systems were calibrated not for the constant hum of traffic or the shrill ping of notifications, but for the subtle rhythms of a quieter world. Ironically, what we now call silence may be closer to our natural baseline than the modern soundscape we've come to normalize. Here's the startling part. When mice were exposed to 2 hours of silence a day, researchers discovered increased neurogenesis in their hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory, emotion, and learning. In other words, silence triggered brain growth. The absence of sound didn't signify decay or emptiness, it sparked renewal. In silence, the brain begins to heal. The self begins to return. That's a what if silence isn't the absence of life, but its restoration. What if it's not a vacuum, but a force, a presence so vital it reshapes our biology, rewires our perception, and resurrects parts of us we didn't know had withered? This is the question that pulses at the heart of our noisy age. In a world optimized for attention, distraction, and volume, silence may be the most endangered experience on Earth. And yet, in its disappearance, we may finally begin to understand what it means to listen, not just to the world, but to the parts of ourselves we've long kept quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, the forgotten sense. Asterisk, asterisk. Silence is often misunderstood as mere emptiness, the blank canvas between sounds. the absence of noise. But what if silence is not a void, but a presence in its own right, not just the muting of the external world, but a tuning inward, a state of heightened sensory and cognitive openness, like vision or touch? Silence may be a sense, a forgotten one, that allows us to perceive the world in its most nuanced, unfiltered form. It is not passive, it listens, it reveals. Before the roar of engines and the constant ping of digital life, silence was not rare, it was rhythm. In pre-industrial societies, it framed the essential moments of being. Silence was woven into rituals of birth, death, and communovich. It anchored deliberation in councils and was held as a sacred space for grief. In quiet, communities found cohesion. In stillness, they found meaning. It wasn't silence for silence's sake. It was understood as a medium through which the sacred, the wise, and the collective could speak. Across cultures, silence was seen not as a failure of speech but as the depth beneath it. In many indigenous traditions, silence is a sign of respect, a way of listening with the whole self. In Eastern philosophies, particularly within Taoist and Zen Buddhist thought, silence represents not ignorance, but clarity, the unspoken truth that words only distort. Where the West often prizes the eloquent speaker, these traditions have long revered the silent one, the one who listens, who waits, who absorbs. But silence, like so many ancestral tools, began to vanish with the rise of industry. The Industrial Revolution didn't just reshape cities and economies, it restructured consciousness. The clatter of machines and the regimentation of time pulled people from natural rhythms and into artificial urgency. With the advent of radio, then television, and eventually the omnipresent glow of the smartphone, the invasion of inner space was complete. Noise ceased to be environmental, it became psychological. We internalized it, we became it, and the body keeps the score. Chronic noise, even low level, triggers a persistent release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this elevates blood pressure, suppresses the immune system, and alters brain function. Studies have shown that children exposed to constant background noise, like the hum of traffic or electronics, develop reduced working memory and language skills. Adults suffer too shorter attention spans, fragmented sleep, heightened anxiety. We are not just distracted, we are neurologically under siege. The urgency is not philosophical, it is biological. Burnout, insomnia, anxiety disorders, and rising cognitive dysfunction are not just byproducts of busy lives, they are symptoms of a world without quiet. In schools where silence is rare, students struggle to concentrate. In hospitals, recovery slows in noisy wards. In cities, constant sonic assault shortens lives. Without silence, we're not merely unfocused, we become fragmented. The self, deprived of the space it needs to integrate experience, begins to fray. Silence, then, is not luxury. It is infrastructure, a biological necessity as vital as sleep, nutrition, or touch. And in forgetting this sense, we may be losing something more than peace. We may be losing the coherence of our own minds. Only in paragraph from the noise machine to in today's world. Silence is often treated not as a resource, but as a problem, a signal of disengagement, awkwardness, or inefficiency. In classrooms, teachers fill every second with instruction or media, fearing that silence means students are bored or unproductive. In politics, a candidate who pauses too long risks being seen as uncertain or weak. In business, silence is often mistaken for stagnation. Meetings, emails, brainstorming sessions must be constantly filled with noise to prove that work is happening. Stillness is rarely seen as a form of intelligence. Instead, we've built a world where noise equals progress. This obsession has a history. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring machines, it brought machine logic into human lives. Factory floors operated under relentless noise, and later, open-plan offices were designed to mimic that hum of productivity. Add in 24/7 news cycles, algorithm-driven content streams, and the rise of constant self-marketing, and we've created a culture of perpetual sensory alertness. The brain, once attuned to intermittent sounds in a natural world, is now bombarded without pause. It's not just information overload, it's meaning dilution. The more we hear, the less we process. This has sparked growing concern in medicine and mental health. Diagnoses of ADHD are soaring, particularly among children who grow up without quiet, their developing brains conditioned to constant novelty and distraction. Some therapists have begun prescribing sensory fasting, structured periods of silence and stillness, not as spiritual practice, but as neurological treatment. The science backs it up. Silence strengthens focus, deepens memory consolidation, and lowers stress hormones. Our brains need silence like our lungs need oxygen. In hospitals, the consequences are especially clear. Studies show that patients in quieter environments experience faster recovery times, better sleep, and lower anxiety levels. Yet many modern hospitals are sonic battlegrounds filled with alarms, intercoms, and bustling corridors. Some pioneering clinics are now enforcing quiet zones, finding that even modest reductions in ambient noise dramatically improve outcomes. The implication is stark. Noise doesn't just distract, it delays healing. Despite this, myths persist. One popular belief is that background music enhances concentration, but repeated studies contradict this, showing that while certain tasks may benefit from low-level sound, silence consistently outperforms noise in memory retention, deep thinking, and emotional regulation. Yet the myth endures not because it's true, but because silence feels foreign, and because noise sells. That's the deeper conflict. Capitalism has a vested interest in destroying silence. In the attention economy, every pause is a missed opportunity to monetize every moment of stillness, a blank billboard. Algorithms feed on clicks, and silence generates none. So we are trained to fill every gap with podcasts, videos, messages, pings. The result is a kind of cultural claustrophobia, where we fear the very condition we most need to recover. Yet, resistance is growing. Movements advocating for quiet parks, silent dining, digital detoxes, and sensory retreats are pushing back, reclaiming silence as a public good. These aren't luxuries, they're survival strategies. But they also raise a difficult moral question. Who gets access to silence? In a noisy world, silence is becoming a privilege found in remote nature preserves, soundproof homes, or expensive wellness retreats. For the marginalized, those in dense cities, loud workplaces, overcrowded schools, silence is increasingly out of reach. And so, the stakes sharpen. If silence is healing, vital, and essential to our humanity, then its erosion is not just a cultural shift, it's a public health crisis, a justice issue, a philosophical reckoning. In the war between noise and stillness, we must ask, what are we losing? And who is losing it first? The hidden language of silence. We've been thinking about silence all wrong. It's not the opposite of communication. It may be its purest form. In the most primal moments of life, before language exists, silence is how we connect. A mother's gaze meeting her infant's eyes, the calm rhythm of her breathing, the steady presence of touch. These are silent exchanges that shape the infant's emotional reality. Research shows that these pre-verbal interactions build the foundation for emotional security and relational trust. The child doesn't need words to know they are safe. They feel it in the quiet. This truth echoes across healing spaces. For many trauma survivors, words can be overwhelming, insufficient, or even what often brings relief is not talking, but being in the presence of someone who listens with their whole body, without interruption or expectation. Therapists and caregivers have learned what ancient traditions already knew, that healing often begins where language ends. Across cultures, silence is not seen as a gap to be filled but a space to be honored. In many indigenous languages, silence is used to express respect, to allow emotion to speak, or to let nature respond. In Eastern spiritual traditions, silence is not emptiness, but presence, a field of awareness where wisdom arises not from external information, but from internal clarity. Here, silence is not passive, it is intelligent. It listens back, and then comes the evolutionary twist. Humans did not evolve in a world of constant sound. Our ancestors lived in rhythmic, acoustic environments. The silence of night broken by wind or animal calls, the pause between heartbeats and footsteps, the balance of speech and listening. Our nervous systems are built not for relentless input, but for cycles, for the rise and fall of noise, the ebb and flow of attention, the space between breaths. Silence is not a modern invention or spiritual luxury. It's a biological rhythm encoded in our very design. This changes everything. Noise isn't just annoying. It's disruptive. When we fill every gap with sound, background music, social media, constant chatter, we interrupt the timing. Our bodies were built to follow. Modern noise isn't neutral. It's a stressor that fractures our internal coherence. The world has sped up and filled in, but our nervous systems haven't caught up. We are biologically out of sync. And so the realization lands with full weight. Silence isn't about tuning out, it's about tuning in. It's not a retreat from life, but a return to its original pace, its deeper pulse. We've mistaken silence for absence, when it has always been the ground of presence, and in rediscovering it, we may not just restore our minds, we may reawaken something far older, far wiser, waiting in the stillness to be heard. What silence does to the brain. Silence, far from being inert, is one of the most biologically active states the brain can enter. Neuroscientists have found that when external noise ceases, the brain doesn't shut down, it lights up. In moments of silence, the brain's default mode network activates, a system associated with introspection, memory consolidation, and creative thinking. This is the neural space where identity is processed, where past experiences are integrated into a coherent sense of self. Silence, in this light, becomes a kind of mental homecoming, the environment where the mind reorganizes, repairs, and reclaims itself. The effects go deeper. Studies show that even short periods of silence stimulate neurogenesis in the hippocampus, literally creating new brain cells, particularly in regions responsible for learning and emotional regulation. Silence lowers blood pressure, reduces cortisol levels, and recalibrates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, making us less reactive and more emotionally stable. In shared silence, mirror neurons, the basis of empathy, fire more synchronously between people, suggesting that silence doesn't isolate us, it synchronizes us. It deepens the emotional resonance between human beings in ways that speech sometimes distorts. These insights are not just theoretical. In trauma therapy, silence is now being used deliberately, not as avoidance, but as healing space. Silence allows the nervous system to settle, giving trauma-impacted individuals room to reprocess pain without the cognitive overload of constant verbalization. In classrooms, experiments with silent learning zones show significant improvements in attention, retention, and emotional regulation. Students learn not just facts, but how to listen to themselves, to each other, and to the material. Silence, it turns out, is pedagogical. Architecture, too, is waking up to the power of silence. The deliberate design of quiet spaces, libraries, sacred buildings, natural preserves, serves a function beyond aesthetics. These are environments where silence is not just permitted but protected, reinforcing the idea that stillness is spatially as well as neurologically necessary. Urban quiet zones and remote sound sanctuaries are emerging around the world, part of a growing movement to safeguard silence as a human right, not a luxury for the privileged, but a resource vital to public mental health. The evidence keeps building. A prison rehabilitation program in Norway uses extended periods of silence as part of restorative justice. Participants report lower aggression, greater emotional insight, and a shift in self-perception. At tech-free retreats and digital detox camps, people consistently describe emotional breakthroughs, not from stimulation, but from its suspension. Silence, for many, reintroduces them to a part of themselves they didn't know was missing. And this is the crux of it. Silence is not an absence of input, but a reorientation of awareness. It's not a void, but a vessel, one in which the brain heals, the self coheres, and relationships deepen. The science is clear. Silence is not a luxury, a weakness, or a retreat. It is a biologically active state, one our nervous systems hunger for, or our minds thrive in, and our culture has nearly forgotten how to value. Reclaiming it may be one of the most vital acts of collective healing left to us. The shared stillness. Two people sit side by side. No words pass between them. No gestures are exchanged. And yet something unmistakable is happening. An awareness, a warmth, a recognition that runs deeper than speech. It is not awkwardness that fills the space, but presence. In the quiet, neither is performing, persuading, or proving. They are simply there, together. And in that shared stillness, a different kind of communication unfolds, one that doesn't ask to be explained, only felt. Silence, then, is not a void. It is the vessel that holds what cannot be said. It is the breath between thoughts where meaning has room to settle, the space in which grief softens, memory finds its shape, and empathy grows its roots. In silence, we stop editing ourselves. We begin to witness, and perhaps, in that witnessing, something sacred is restored, not because silence adds anything, but because it finally takes nothing. In a world louder than ever, with voices clamoring for attention, platforms built on performance, and systems that monetize our every reaction, what might we hear if we stopped speaking? What might we remember if we stopped scrolling? Who might we become if we simply listened to the world, to each other, to ourselves? Silence is not the absence of connection. It is the depth of it. The original language of awe, of understanding, of love unspoken and still fully known. It asks nothing, sells nothing, demands nothing, and in that, gives us everything we've forgotten how to receive. So let us leave this not with answers, but with space. A space where noise does not intrude, a space where the soul is allowed to return to itself, a space not to be filled, but to be honored as something necessary, sacred, and deeply, unforgettably human.